Good
Hey,
morning.
this
Morning, Harry.
is Harry Siegel with the Daily News here with my colleague Robert George of the New York Post. And we're here today to talk about crime in New York City. It's a, it's a bit of an interesting flashback moment for New York crime stuff. Donald Trump, who I don't think many people thought 2 decades ago was still going to be on the scene in quite the same way. Back when he was talking about wolf packs and putting out full page, bring back the death penalty ads, is running for
That's right.
president. Curtis Sliwa of the Guardian Angels is in the New York Post today, talking about how dangerous the city's become, in his view, under this mayor. City Hall try farce. Our leaders just can't face the facts on crime. And Al Sharpton, of course, is consulting regularly with Bill De Blasio. Another person who at the time, Reverend Bacon, seemed to be a transitory figure, would have his 15 minutes, and those have gone on for decades now. So we just had a record low crime year for murders and for the 7 index crimes, and yet there's all this concern that New York is getting more dangerous under Mayor De Blasio, that maybe stop and frisk the significant reduction in stop and frisk. You know, De Blasio promised to reform the stop and frisk era to end it. Is creating perhaps a more dangerous city, or is this just tabloids making scary sounds? Right.
I think that was actually a very great rundown that you had here in terms of talking about how much has changed in New York City in the last 20 years, and conversely, how little has changed. I mean, you cannot have two more different mayors than Rudy Giuliani back then and Bill De Blasio right now. However, it's how fascinating that so many of the supporting characters are actually still around. As you said, Donald Trump is still around. He's not necessarily around as a sort of day-to-day day-to-day tabloid fodder in New York as he might have been, but he pops up in different forms. And Reverend Al, if there's something of a through line of New York City in terms of flashpoints of crime and race and controversy, that and Bill Bratton, of course. But the through line is kind of Al Sharpton, from being the nemesis to Rudy Giuliani. Rudy Giuliani needed him about as much as Sharpton needed Giuliani, and then. Michael Bloomberg, I think, had a rather kind of novel and rather smart strategy in terms of figuring out how, to use an old basketball phrase, he realized, you can't really control Al Sharpton. You can just hope to contain him, and that's kind of what he did. What he came in 2002. He shook hands with him, and he decided it was better for him to have Sharpton on the inside pissing out than on the outside pissing in, and that was actually rather useful for that. Doesn't usually. Yeah, I may be wrong, but I think the only real flare. I mean, there were a number of police shootings during the Bloomberg years, but the only one that became a huge front page protest and things like that was the Sean Bell one. And otherwise, Al Sharpton was rather kind of quiet. In fact, he collaborated with people like Joel Klein, the school's chancellor. He was going to the White House, things like that. But then, all bets are off. You've got a new mayor, and Sharpton kind of returns in his sort of Koch Giuliani form, but in a slightly later. And then again, Bill Bratton is the police commissioner, and once again, it's kind of interesting. He may or may not, I'm not sure, be once again getting ahead of his boss and making lots and lots of media statements himself, which again may or may not be to his detriment. So the more things change in New York City, the more they remain the same.
Are you thinking about his request? This is the second straight year, and last year he backed off at the end and didn't get any for more cops, for money in the budget to get more police officers. When Braden met with our editorial board, he said, and this was a few months ago, this is going to be a negotiation between me and the mayor and the city council, which is, interesting because, that's like saying a negotiation with my boss. And for the second straight year, he's asking for more police officers. And up till now, at least, de Blasio has not allocated any money for those officers.
That's right. But look, one of the very Bill Bratton is a rather media savvy is a very media savvy person, for good or ill. I mean, that's what got him in trouble / fired 2 decades ago when he ended up on the front page of on the front cover of Time magazine, and he's taking
framed in his office now.
And what? Which is
that front page of Time magazine with Bill Bratton as the man who saved New York and brought crime under control. No Rudy Giuliani, which infuriated him. He's got it framed in his office at One Police Plaza now.
That's what I had not visited police One Police Plaza since Mr. Bratton was in there. So that's fascinating. That's hilarious, actually, on a number of levels. But yeah, no, I was thinking about the fact that he's using the media and sort of having a kind of a conversation because for their own political reasons, the city council wants more cops. The mayor, for his own purposes, doesn't. And look, the New York Post editorial board has been very, very harsh on Mayor de Blasio. I will give him some credit here. Because I think a good argument can be made that they may need to be some more cops in certain areas and so forth. But a mayor has to realize that when you're hiring 1,000 cops, you're not just hiring. The budget item isn't just the 40,000, whatever that the first starting couple of years are. It's that plus whatever the contract raises are over 5, 10, 20 years, and then of course you've got the pension and all this other kind of stuff, and that is all. That's what the mayor has to look at when he's figuring out a budget as well. So
what's funny about that, right, is suddenly the police have reason to talk about crime as a problem instead of posting about their success and bringing it down. We've had top officials in the department recently, while Bratton was out of town, say things like cops are struggling with gun violence. There are more guns getting used on the streets, and they're not sure why, right? But if you're pushing for more officers, which are really expensive, like a 30-year expense as opposed to overtime or anything else, saying, "Hey, we're in a bit of trouble here. Send in the reinforcements," starts to make a lot of sense.
Well, yeah, it does, but I'm not necessarily sure that. I am actually pretty sure that the police commissioner doesn't like having a subordinate saying, "Oh, we're struggling here," and even that whole message though of send in the reinforcements, while at the same time, and this is what I meant when I was referring earlier on to the commissioner getting a little bit ahead of the mayor and other things. When you've got a subordinate saying, "Oh, we're really struggling here in terms of getting this gang issues and these shootings under control on the one hand," then you've got the police commissioner sort of coming up with sort of this explanation today. I mean, he had that interview with The Guardian last week where he says, initially he said he was misquoted because the original story was, there's a fewer percentage of African Americans in the NYPD than their numbers should suggest, because more African Americans by percentage have criminal records, and so we can't hire them as cops. he then said he said he was misquoted, and he backtracked, and he said, well, what I meant to say, actually, I'm sorry. He said that, and he said that was partly because stop and frisk, when we stopped some of these people, they're either arrested, or it turns out they've got criminal records, and that makes them ineligible. So that was explanation number one. And then explanation number two was, he said, no, that's not that, they misquoted me. What I meant to say was that the high level of number of stop and frisk, because of what it does to African American men, it makes them less likely to want to become police officers. Which is that's something I can you can kind of debate that. Then later on, he said, well, the Guardian actually didn't completely misquote me the first time around, and then finally it was, well, we've got these issues because of, the breakdown of the American family, and particularly the African American family, and all this other kind of stuff. I don't think that the mayor wants his police commissioner to start dabbling into all of these sociological explanations, when the main issue, when the headlines of both of our newspapers are focusing on the rise in shootings, rise in murders, the rise actually in crime in the subways, and the rise in crime in the subways is a big deal, because particularly for Bill Bratton. Because, as you know, that's where he got his start. I mean, he kind of made his bones back when the subway cops and the NYPD were like kind of separate entities. He was running that, and that was his. Before he became police commissioner, he was focusing on subway crime, and that sort of became the sharp end of the knife, if you will, against fighting crime in the early '90s. They started tackling it in the subways, and then when he became police commissioner, he took some of the lessons he learned there and took it for the whole NYPD. So that's the thing.
One of the founding myths there, right, of the whole broken windows thing was they started busting people who jumped the turnstiles and came in for free, and paying had been polite but basically optional for a long time. So it turned out that initially,
I'm sorry. Say that again, Harry. What had been optional?
The paying the fare had seemed optional for many New Yorkers for a long time. Like, there wasn't really any consequence if you didn't. So fare beating was pretty rampant. And then they started busting it, and people said, why are you dealing with this small thing? And it turned out that 1 out of every 7 people that they stopped for jumping the turnstile to check and then give a ticket to had an outstanding warrant or a weapon with them. And it ended up grabbing a fair number of guns and knives, and people were wanted for much more serious things. And initially, at least, that was very impressive. But I want to go back to black cops for 1 second. So Arthur Brown, the head of our board, and then we'll come around to crime. He's got a new book coming out about Samuel Battle, the first African American police officer in New York, who had this incredible and interesting life, including a never published memoir co-written with Langston Hughes. So he was sort of going through some of the numbers and research he did for this book and ticking off how many black cops have been on the force, and the numbers are pretty brutal. So 18 years after Battle was hired, the city's 6% black. There's not 1% blacks on the force. This is 1943. Now let's go into like more modern times. 1960. Blacks are underrepresented by about 64%. They're 5% of the department, about 15% of the city. Today, the city is 25% black, and the NYPD is 15% black. So the underrepresentation is 40%. That is not a lot of progress, and that actually precedes the civil rights movement, the decline of the breakdown of the black family. Like all of these explanations, it's been a very, very long-term trend that, for whatever set of reasons, blacks have been pretty significantly underrepresented on the police force. And the last crop that came out of the academy, there were actually more Asians,
right,
who are a much smaller share of the city than black. So I don't know the full answer to that, but this is something that's gone on for a very long time, like long enough that when he sort of points to longer secular reasons that they've been underrepresented, the shortage seems to precede that. But I think the big question right now most that a lot of New Yorkers are asking, and maybe people who look at Drudge and end up seeing stories from both our papers splashed there, is there reason to be scared in New York right now? So when you're pointing to the subway crime, the increase so far this year in murders and shootings, and there was a similar increase last year, and the number of murders was down, the number of shootings was brought really under control and was about the same by the end of the year, where it went up in the spring, and then the NYPD seemed to get a hold of it. Is there reason for concern, and is the dialing back of stop and frisk since 2011 suddenly making people more comfortable bringing guns out or being violent?
Well, I mean, that's that's the big issue, and I mean, you've written a number of a number of really great columns with a lot of insight, and I'm not just saying that because we're supposed to be nice on Blogging Heads and so forth, but actually, maybe are we supposed to be nice on Blogging Heads? That's an open question.
Well, we're not supposed to be crossfire, but we can take a couple shots.
It's definitely not actually kind of an appropriate word to be using given the conversation we're talking about right now, crossfire. Look, I'm humble enough to say, as a member of the of an editorial board, and we like to think of ourselves in terms of the big group, as sort of gods from Olympus, imparting wisdom on the citizenry. I personally don't know, and I think you'd admit the same thing, is that you don't know exactly, what's going on there. But I don't think it's completely and totally unfair to think just in terms of human nature that if whenever you go out, I mean, particularly if you happen to be involved in a particularly criminal enterprise, there's obviously always going to be like in a regular entrepreneurial activity, there's always going to be cost benefit analysis in terms of what you're going to do, risks and so forth. And if you think that it's now less likely that you're going to be stopped by a police officer, you're going to start thinking that since the risk has reduced, I'm going to be a little bit more bold or more comfortable, and whether it's carrying a gun or carrying contraband or what have you. I mean, I think that's just kind of human nature. Now, if you then just take that isolated individual and then try and spread it out in particular neighborhoods, again, I don't know. Look, I think that the commissioner's statement about it last week, and we ran a version of it on our pages in the Post, where he said that the high point number for stop and frisk was 2011. And it started shrinking. Then, actually, even before.
There's an irony there, right? Because
that was under Kelly. Yeah, that was under.
De Blasio generally wants to say, "I ended this era," and in fact, after there was this lawsuit and the issue sort of became very politicized, like stop and frisk, generally speaking, like the ability of police to stop people is a basic policing tool. The Supreme Court's dealt with this repeatedly. There's not really an issue. It's how many there were in New York. And the number went up to nearly 700,000. From a much lower baseline, partly because they were getting logged better, and like every stop was actually getting recorded. But all this political heat built up, and then Kelly in his last couple of years takes all the takes the air out. So when De Blasio comes in pledging to end this, it's already sort of ended. And generally, De Blasio and Braden have avoided mentioning this too much. But now, when people are calling for it to return, they're saying, look, if stop and frisk was the issue, that wound down in 2012 and 2013. Why weren't murders going up then? So now suddenly they have reason to credit their predecessors with doing this, where previously I'd say they'd done their best to ignore that.
Well, this is when we decided we were going to do this, and I was kind of thinking about some of the interesting ironies that are abound here. This is kind of like, I think, right at the top. First of all, you're right. The reduction in stop and frisk well, first of all, the increase in stop and frisk obviously was led by Ray Kelly and Michael Bloomberg in the early 2000s. By the way, if you were able to create a diagram, you would have seen that as the number of cops went down, partly because of budgetary reasons. That as the number of cops went down, the number of stop and frisks increased, and that was basically became it was a strategy by Kelly, obviously saying, okay, I've got less manpower. How do we kind of maximize that to kind of keep the crime numbers on the downward trend? As they've been going on. At that point, it was for 10 years and growing. So
10 years of crime going down, and the police force gets larger and then smaller over the course of those 10 years. So it's now about 34,000, down from a peak of 42,000.
That's exactly right. So that was a smart strategy. Then you start getting the pushback on stop and frisk. So, but I have to double. I'll have to. You may have the numbers. You may actually have the dates right there in front of you. I'm pretty sure that the Kelly started the downward trend on stop and frisk even before the initial judicial verdict, the initial judicial decision, declaring the way it was being run as unconstitutional. You might actually have to again. You might check.
Right.
We might want to check the dates on that. But I'm pretty sure that basically Kelly had started to pull back the reins on it. But now here's the important part, and this is where in a sense I think. Bratton and de Blasio and Bratton are sort of kind of almost. I don't know whether Kelly meant to do this, but it seemed that he may have kind of set an awkward trap for them. They pull back on stop and frisk, but they never say that. They don't say that that's what they're doing. Publicly, it's always if we pull back on this and we take this, you're going to start to see this is effective, it's constitutional. If we pull back on this, we're going to be going back to the bad old days, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, you get the judicial verdicts, and then there's a back and forth, and the city fights back against Shira Scheindlin, and then you get the second circuit
that's the
comes
judge
in.
Who
Judge Scheindlin. She was the one who declared that, as practiced, stop and frisk in New York was unconstitutional,
and that's because so many more young Black and Hispanic people were being stopped and frisked than their share of the city's population, and mostly men, which is significant, right? Because if this was really a straight broken windows thing, and it's like somebody smoking a joint, say, right, is a problem of the quality of life in the neighborhood, you'd expect to have about an even split in arrests or stops, between men and women. In practice, it was about 90% men, because the NYPD was trying to use these stops to separate, as Jack Maple once put it, the sharks from the dolphins. And going at the sharks, you start looking at young men, 15 or so to mid to late 20s, who are more likely to be doing other things. And the number of stops of Black and Hispanic men matched up quite closely with the percentage of significant crimes that they were committing in the city, but not with the population numbers. And that was the fundamental question. So it became a tax.
The argument that was coming from the administration, and I tend to agree with this, is that most of the bulk of the stop and frisk, it was not that they were just generally speaking matching the profile of this given population, but they were in fact matching descriptions of individual suspects.
Yes,
and given that these things were happening, in primarily minority neighborhoods, it's not surprising that the people who were being stopped would reflect the membership in that neighborhood.
And the overwhelming majority of people who were stopped, of course, hadn't done anything wrong. And
That's right.
de Blasio made a big point of that. And he said, we've ended this because we want to stop people only after they've really done something. You know, that's the difference between what we're doing and what they were doing. They were just stopping everyone in certain neighborhoods for no really good reason. But what de Blasio tries to avoid mentioning is that the hit rate, as in the number of people you stop who have done who have done something wrong, or have an outstanding warrant or something like that, has gone up from about 12% to I think about 17%. So that's better. But the overwhelming majority of people who are getting stopped now have done nothing wrong. In fact, it's very hard to imagine a system in which police are only stopping guilty people, or mostly stopping guilty
Yeah.
people. It's just
Well, no, that's
there's an
exactly right.
absurdity baked in.
Well, but you know, to finish the earlier point, this is what was kind of fascinating. So Kelly and under Kelly and Bloomberg, you reach peak stop and frisk, and then you hit this downward trend, which is, you know, supposedly we may have maxed out at that point right now. But again, the key thing is, by not announcing that that's exactly what they're doing, at least not until maybe the very end, maybe the last year they started to you know, they kind of release the numbers for the neighborhoods that are most impacted by stop and frisk, both adversely in terms of the frustrations of young men who are regularly stopped and patted down, and they haven't done anything wrong, and are law abiding citizens. The message that's kind of going out for them, plus the not so law abiding, is that, you know, nothing has really changed. And if you're somebody who gets stopped, let's just say in a year, gets stopped, you know, I don't know, let's say 5 to 10 times over the course of a year. I'm just throwing that number out. You do not necessarily notice if that changes from 5 to 10 to, say, 3 to 7. You know, you're not just going to notice. It just becomes, you know, this is the way life is, and I'm going to have to kind of suck it up, and it's incredibly frustrating, and it's humiliating, and so forth. But cumulatively, of course, that means that number is going down. But if you're not publicizing it, nothing has necessarily changed. Then Bratton and de Blasio come in and say, it's a new day, there's a new sheriff in town, we're ending this unconstitutional practice, we're dropping the challenge to the lawsuit on this, and it's a completely brand new day. So now people actually know that that the actual policy has actually changed, and they can feel the fact that the cops are not engaging them as much as they were. And so for those on our board, and I think for some reason I always think that there must be very interesting debates going on in the New York Daily News editorial board, because I sometimes think that there's with the Post, what's the word I'm looking for? The stereotype. They figure that we're these right-wing lunatics who want to give the cops all this power, and if anything kind of changes, it's horrible, and the sky will be kind of falling, and so forth. The Daily News definitely takes I will admit to this, a more nuanced approach on some of these kind of crime and neighborhood issues. So I can just imagine how some of those some of the conversations that are kind of going on, because you have a column, I know where you're coming from. But then when I start actually seeing some of the actual editorials, I think that there's there's kind of interesting tension there. But the point being, stop and frisk was going down. De Blasio and Bratton announced that it's gone, and I think that the message that that then goes, particularly to the bad people, that there is a new day in town is something to be worried about, and may be contributing to the spikes in murder and shootings that we've seen.
So here's what's interesting, right? Nobody knows how significant stop and frisk as a tactic it was to the continued decline in crime. Like, New York has a 20-plus year now downward trend. For the first half of that, crime is declining pretty significantly nationally. That accounts for about half of New York's drop. So New York has a much, much larger drop than if it followed the national patterns, and actually does so while imprisoning less people, even as incarceration rates nationally are continuing to rise. So something's different here, right? But there are all these different factors. You have new policing philosophy, new technology, and CompStat in particular, the hiring of many more cops over the first half of the crime decline, and then stop and frisk. And so isolating the effect of any one of those is complicated. And I think stop and frisk has become a shorthand in a lot of ways for aggressive policing, more generally, and how aggressive police should be in high crime areas, which necessarily means that they're going to be dealing with a lot of people in those areas in an attempt that's been incredibly successful to protect them. Like, we didn't win the war on drugs or the war on poverty. We didn't really halt like the breakdown of the traditional family, but we've had this tremendous success in the war on crime. So something's happened. Something has shifted to make that happen. It doesn't match demographics. It doesn't match what's happened nationally. But no one here really knows. It's not like a controlled scientific experiment. Police commissioners have a lot of reason not to want it to seem like one. No one here really knows what they did that worked. And so this one tactic became a shorthand. And ironically, that really started off with the reformers, right? There was this form called the 250 you were supposed to fill out every time you stop someone, right. Maybe question them, and then maybe frisk them. And they weren't always filled out, and suddenly they were. So that accounts for an unknown, but I think pretty significant part of the increase in the numbers. Like the baseline had been false. And then Kelly does use this as like a management technique to keep cops active and to get more out of a smaller force. And the numbers keep going down, but they're ticking down at this point, right? Like, these aren't the bad old days or the early 90s. In 2000 murders, it's like, how can we keep getting to new record lows? And this is the number that keeps going up. So it sort of dominates the conversation. But I think it's an open question how significant that was to either the drop or keeping a lid on how high the numbers go up. So narratively, it makes a ton of sense. If police are stopping less people, more people will carry guns. And we're seeing some signs that that's the case. But the truth is, I think we're all sort of guessing and getting a little out ahead on our skis that there's a new philosophy. Here's a warning sign. Oh no, it's starting. Really, before having a chance to see if that's the case. You know, as I said, last year, crime went up in the spring. Shootings and murders were up. People, including both our editorial boards, were very concerned. And by the end of the year, it was back down. This year, same thing. And we're going to see now there's this a summer all-in program, right? Which is basically just dumping lots of new cops in the areas where crime's been the highest. And effectively, instead of hiring new cops, right, it's overtime. You have just more of a presence out. And last year, that seemed to be reasonably successful. Or in any case, the rise in murders and shootings got controlled and then brought back down. This year, we're gonna see. I think there's some breath holding at the moment, even as people looking at our front pages might think the die is already cast.
Well, I think so, but last week I was at the Federalist Society, the New York chapter of the Federalist Society. For those don't, the Federalist Society is an association of conservative philosophy, legal minds, lawyers and retired judges and so forth. The New York chapter put on this rather interesting event at the Cornell Club. It was a debate over police practices with the head lawyer on the major stop and frisk case, plus the conservative legal. The conservative legal mind, Leonard, his name is going to come to me anyway, and Heather McDonald from the Manhattan Institute, and who's written pieces for both of our papers, and she's
has grabbed a lot of attention recently for saying perhaps we're seeing some sort of Ferguson effect and a lot of pushback on this, and the start of a national crime rise.
Right. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. I mean, she's the hardest of the hardcore, in terms of supporting aggressive policing and support. But she also look. She's not just a pointy-headed academic. Heather does her own independent reporting. She goes into neighborhoods. She talks to people living there in previously high crime neighborhoods or right on the edge neighborhoods. And so she does her own report. She does her own reporting as well. But here's the interesting kicker: the moderator for this panel was Judge Shira Scheindlin. So it was very smart. The person who put it together is a lawyer friend of mine named Mark Smith, and it was very smart of him, to have a Federalist Society event. And you've got there are two conservative leading people. You've got the stop-and-frisk lawyer, and as the moderator, you've got the judge who let's quote ended stop and frisk from a constitutional standpoint here in New York, and it was a good conversation. I will say this: Judge Scheindlin probably should probably have her own show at some point, because she's very charming, very charismatic, and she's got that that kind of TV show judge of aspect of taking no nonsense and say, look, I'll take any question. I'll take questions, but there'll be no yelling here. Da, da, da. She actually told me that when I got upset about something. But at some point, one point she said, when this issue of the shootings and the murder was going on, and the response taking in also response that the mayor and the commissioner said, well, crime is down even though murders and shootings are up, which to some people that seemed a little bit tone deaf, kind of sort of like, well, yes, Mrs. Lincoln, but how did you like the play, that kind of thing. But she said at one point, look, you were talking to the people in this room, you are no more, you are no less safe now than you were 4 years ago. And people said no, that kind of thing. And anyway, the conversation then kind of continued. When it got time for
the
Q&A,
numbers back that up. Like every major category of crime is down from 4 years ago.
Yeah, but this is the key point here. I had as soon as she'd said that, I rocketed my hand up, and she said, "Well, no, we'll be taking questions at the end." And so, but she came back and asked me that. I said, "Well, you said that no one. You said no one in this room. Everyone in this room is no less safe than they were 4 years ago." I said, "Would you make that same statement about people in, say, East New York, or certain parts of the Bronx, or what have you?" And she said, "No, I wouldn't." And that's, look, I give her credit for answering honestly. And that's ultimately the kind of question, because, even in the worst days, 20 some years ago, there were not huge amounts of bodies that were stacking up in Midtown Manhattan. It's always been outer boroughs and Upper Manhattan and so forth. That's where the trouble spots had historically been. Now, obviously, because of gentrification and so forth, those neighborhoods, all those kind of neighborhoods have changed over the last 20 years. But if we're seeing a spike, and if it's a spike that's something having to do with more than just weather conditions, the summer and all this other kind of spring and summer and so forth, if it's something more, those are going to be the neighborhoods that are going to be impacted. The poor neighborhoods, and shouldn't we? I mean, from our relatively comfortable middle class existence, that's something that we should be worried and concerned about, and more than just in terms of like an academic exercise.
Well, both de Blasio and Braden have shrugged off some of the increase as gangbangers shooting at gangbangers, which
But
obviously,
that's
if you're in a
always been the
neighborhood
case.
where
That's always been the case.
yeah, where and both our papers have become expert, or probably we're already expert at finding in the aftermath of some knucklehead in Bed-Stuy pulling out a gun at 3 p.m, finding the 50-year-old dude who was going grocery shopping and got hit in the shoulder. And
or the little kid, who's shot in the
mm-hmm.
shot because they start shooting up a bus or something like that. Yeah, exactly.
That's terrifying. And definitionally, the people having gunplay outside are not going to be good actors. So all that said, I'm just about certain the horrible way the NYPD handles statistics makes it hard for me to immediately pull this out. But the shootings in East New York, in Brownsville, in the most difficult precincts in the Bronx, and murders are also down from 4 years ago, even as we've had these increases. And these are also some of the places where the number of stops plunged. At least on paper, in East New York and Brownsville, no one is getting stopped, almost literally. And
do you have a year to year numbers? I mean,
no,
like
that's
last year.
If anyone from the NYPD is listening, the way you guys
or watching, yeah,
handle, yes, look at me. The way you guys handle numbers is atrocious. So they basically put out a PDF, right? Not like a spreadsheet or something you can compare to earlier numbers. Once a week, that is 1 week behind, even though they have the up-to-date numbers there at one police plaza. And then every time they put up a PDF, the last PDF disappears. So there are all these useful, actually public numbers that are just very hard to actually find or quickly compare. Whether this is willful obscurity, laziness, or both is an open question. I'm willing to go with all the above, but it's actually outrageous. It's if you go to other cities, if you go to Los Angeles, for instance, right? They just take all the crime numbers and they put them out in a spreadsheet. And then nerds, and there are many, many nerds, even in Los Angeles, which is not nearly as bright or good-looking a city as New York. There are many, many nerds who make maps, so you can see if say burglaries in your neighborhood are going up or down.
They do the same thing. There's a great blog, the name of which is escaping me right now. It's Red something or other. But in Chicago, there's this great blog that does exactly what you're talking about. Exactly. Yep. Which, considering New York, you'd think that there would be actually nerds out there who'd be able to actually do that just on a week-to-week basis, even though the NYPD disappears them down the rabbit hole.
And there's a data law the council has passed that basically requires them to give all this stuff up. It remains unclear if they're going to even comply with, but it's a long-standing frustration when you're trying to see these numbers. The one last thing I'd really like to say is, as there are these concerns and open questions, when you see that murders are up 45% or numbers like that, ignore them. What you're seeing are headlines stripped and denuded of all context. So it's murders in the same week to week. Say in Manhattan, we're up 45%, meaning in the 15th week of the year, there were 7 murders this year where there were 4 last year. There are a lot of those sorts of numbers going around. There is, frankly, in good times and bad, there is always, thank God for us tabloids, something horrific happening to someone in New York City. And you combine that murder up 45% and horrific thing, and you can get a feeling of a real decline and chaos, and oh God, things are going in the wrong direction well before they're there. And lastly, just that it's very important not to confuse momentum with position. That if at the end of this year,
are you going Heisenberg on me right now, Harry Siegel?
If murder is up 8% at the end of this year, this would be I think the third lowest year ever. If index crime was up the same, I believe it would be the second lowest year ever, behind last year. So I mean that's a hell of a starting point. It also means that small numeric increases come off as big percentages. That the NYPD is in some ways punished for having set the baseline as low as it is.
Well, yeah, I hear you, and I agree with you to a point, because as we all know, there are lies, damn lies, and statistics. I would not, even if this was the third, if it becomes, only the third lowest in terms of crime and murder and so forth. We don't want that though to be a hinge point where where it starts ending up. And then next year, if it does increase again, it says, well, it's only the fourth lowest since dot 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 dot. That's where the debate is. That's what we're trying to struggle over right now, because
right.
So.
But I mean, the counter concern always, and this is a conversation we've had on our board, right? It is both our papers are going to find someone, a good victim, so to speak, right? A child or a true innocent, like not somebody who's involved in anything bad or criminal, who gets killed, and say this is happening because of these policies. And that second part, the because, is what's really, really complicated. So while there are these concerns, like are we suddenly headed in the wrong direction? There's also a decent chance that we've established a real new baseline, and numbers will move up a bit and will move down a bit. And taking every one of these, Andrew Cuomo just sort of gave up on Albany for a minute and went to find these two guys who escaped from an upstate prison. Because that's like an awesome roll up your sleeves, manly thing to do. And Albany's a depressing place.
Got in the way of the people who are actually out there trying to look for them.
Yes, exactly. And there's a temptation as we tell these narratives, right, to be like, Bill de Blasio, Bill Braden, man up and get out in the streets and stop this stuff from happening. That can be really really counterproductive. Nobody wants to treat murders as or any serious crime as background noise, or just actuarially. But the truth is, whatever policies are in place, bad things are going to happen, and sort of using every one to show these danger signs, I think, is in itself potentially dangerous. We may get to find out.
Yeah, well, obviously, in no way will I ever criticize my fine colleagues as they do everything they can to find out exactly what is happening on the fine streets of New York, and present it in its most gripping way to get people to purchase my paper, purchase your paper, so we can find great newspapers. And by the way, we are actually very fortunate to be working and living in a city that can, knock on wood, support three big daily newspapers, and so we're always looking for these things. But yeah, I think it is important. I mean, the biggest story over the last 2 decades has been the turnaround of crime, obviously, in the United States. I mean, and there are lots of broader demographic reasons for that, but New York City has been the leader in that. As much as crime has gone down nationally, it's gone down in New York at a greater rate. And it's been so successful. We've had so many captains and chiefs and so forth in New York that have gone on to relatively good success in many other cities. So what we proved in terms of crime, to use the old Sinatra line, if it can happen here, it can happen anywhere. If we can get it done, if we were able to get it done in terms of crime here, fantastic. But now, if the leader in that starts to get a little bit wobbly, and we start seeing some numbers that we don't want to see, I don't want us to start, becoming the leader in things going back in the wrong direction. And so the fact, as long as our reporters are out there, bringing some of this often bad news to readers, and then we're here to try and sift through the numbers and get through the trends and try and let our readers know exactly what it means. That's what it's all about.
Robert, thanks for taking the time. We're gonna, we all live here. We're gonna find out.
Yeah, absolutely, and hopefully we get a chance to do this again sometime soon.
Cheers. I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks, Harry.